Welcome to my channel, dear listeners. We are making a serious effort to create these contents. In return for the effort, please follow us. If you are ready, our story begins. Daniel Chen's day had started with routine cargo delivery schedules and ended with his freighter's navigation system deciding that catastrophic malfunction was apparently a valid response to encountering an uncharted gravitational anomaly. The crash landing on what his emergency sensors optimistically classified as probably habitable had been controlled in the same way that avalanches were controlled, technically following the laws of physics, but not in any way that suggested competent planning. Now he sat in the wreckage of his cargo bay, taking inventory of emergency supplies that seemed woefully inadequate for extended survival on a planet that looked like someone had let a botanical garden achieve sentience and develop aggressive territorial instincts. The jungle around his crash site pulsed with bioluminescent life forms that created patterns too organized to be random, too alien to be comfortable, and too beautiful to be anything other than probably dangerous. Emergency rations for 2 weeks, water purification tablets for 1 week, basic medical supplies, emergency shelter, and a distress beacon that may or may not be broadcasting into empty space, Daniel muttered, cataloging his resources with the grim efficiency of someone whose career in deep space freight had prepared him for system failures but not necessarily for becoming an involuntary colonist. The emergency shelter deployed with the mechanical reliability of equipment designed by people who understood that space travel involved significant risks of ending up stranded in unpleasant places. It created a basic environmental barrier that would keep out rain, most insects, and hopefully any local wildlife that hadn't developed advanced problem-solving skills. Daniel's pilot training had covered emergency survival protocols extensively, but most of those protocols assumed you'd crashed on worlds with known atmospheric compositions and cataloged dangerous species. This planet seemed determined to violate every assumption about what constituted normal ecological organization, with plants that moved in patterns suggesting consciousness and sounds that implied the local fauna had developed communication systems considerably more sophisticated than his emergency radio. By the time he'd secured his shelter and activated his distress beacon, exhaustion was hitting him with the kind of overwhelming finality that made continued consciousness seem like an optional luxury his body couldn't afford. 3 days of fighting malfunctioning ship systems, followed by a crash landing that had tested his piloting skills beyond their design specifications, had left him running on adrenaline and stubbornness. The jungle's alien sounds created a symphony that was both beautiful and vaguely threatening, like listening to music composed by intelligences that operated according to completely different aesthetic principles. Daniel found himself too tired to maintain the usual paranoid alertness that survival training demanded, too exhausted to worry about unknown predators or hostile environmental conditions. He stripped off his flight suit, which was torn, stained with various fluids from his ship's damaged systems, and generally unsuitable for anything other than being used as emergency bandage material. The emergency shelter's environmental systems were maintaining comfortable temperature and humidity levels, making clothing seem unnecessary for someone whose primary concern was getting enough sleep to function properly tomorrow. Daniel collapsed onto the emergency bedding with the grateful relief of someone whose body had been making increasingly urgent requests for horizontal rest positions for the past 18 hours. His last conscious thought was a vague reminder that he should maintain perimeter security and establish watch schedules, but consciousness was already fading with the inevitability of biological systems reaching their operational limits. He slept with the profound depth of someone whose body had decided that rest was no longer negotiable, regardless of potential environmental threats or unknown planetary dangers. Daniel woke slowly, consciousness returning in layers that suggested his sleep had been both deep and necessary. Something was different about his immediate environment. A weight and warmth that didn't correspond to his emergency bedding configuration, and a sense of being observed that activated dormant survival instincts despite his still groggy mental state. His eyes opened to find himself staring up at a face that definitely hadn't been included in any xenobiology briefings he'd received during pilot training. The woman sitting cross-legged on his chest had pointed ears that suggested non-human heritage, skin with a subtle luminescence that seemed to generate its own soft light, and eyes that held intelligence mixed with scientific curiosity. Interesting bone structure, she said in accented but clearly understandable Standard Galactic, apparently continuing a conversation Daniel hadn't realized was happening. Muscle distribution consistent with bipedal locomotion in standard gravity environments. Cardiovascular system operates within expected parameters for carbon-based life forms. Daniel blinked, his sleep-fogged brain struggling to process the situation. Hello. Respiratory patterns indicate full consciousness has returned, the woman continued, her tone carrying the clinical detachment of someone conducting scientific observation. Vocal cords produce sounds within expected frequency ranges for species utilizing verbal communication. Are you cataloging my biological functions? I am determining whether you represent a threat to local ecological stability, a potential food source, or a previously unknown species requiring diplomatic contact protocols. She leaned closer, studying his face with the kind of focused attention usually reserved for particularly interesting laboratory specimens. Your cranial capacity suggests intelligence comparable to known spacefaring species, which eliminates the food source classification. Daniel became acutely aware that he was completely naked beneath his emergency blanket, while a strange woman who appeared to be conducting a xenobiological survey was sitting on his chest discussing whether he might be edible. Could you possibly conduct this assessment from a position that doesn't involve sitting on top of me? Physical proximity is required for accurate biosignature analysis, she replied matter-of-factly. Your species' electromagnetic field patterns can only be properly measured within a 1-meter radius, and respiratory analysis requires monitoring chest movement during various states of consciousness. Biosignature analysis. Determining metabolic rate, threat assessment capabilities, reproductive status, and compatibility with local atmospheric conditions. She placed her hand on his forehead with the clinical efficiency of someone checking temperature. Your thermal regulation suggests adaptation to environmental conditions similar to local parameters, which indicates temporary survival probability. Daniel looked up at her, trying to reconcile her scientific approach with the distinctly unscientific situation of waking up with a stranger conducting biological surveys while he was completely vulnerable. I'm Daniel Chen, by the way. Cargo freighter pilot, currently stranded after my ship suffered what technical manuals would classify as comprehensive systems failure. I am Kira, xenobiologist specializing in first contact protocols and ecological impact assessment. She shifted her position slightly, apparently finding a more comfortable arrangement for continued scientific observation. Your presence represents the first documented case of your species reaching this system, which requires comprehensive biological and cultural evaluation. And this evaluation requires sitting on me while I'm not wearing any clothes. Your clothing had been removed to facilitate thermal regulation during sleep cycles, which provided optimal opportunity for non-invasive biological assessment. Kira's expression suggested she found his concern about nakedness puzzling rather than understandable. Standard first contact protocols require comprehensive species analysis before determining appropriate interaction frameworks. Daniel realized that what felt like a deeply personal invasion of his privacy was apparently routine scientific methodology from her perspective. Right. So you've been conducting xenobiological research on me while I was unconscious. Unconscious subjects provide more accurate baseline biological data than conscious subjects, who may alter normal physiological responses due to stress or deliberate deception. Kira began tracing patterns on his chest that seemed to correspond to muscle groups, apparently continuing her assessment. Though your awakening allows for behavioral observation that complements the physiological data. Behavioral observation. Response to unexpected situations, communication patterns, social interaction preferences, threat assessment capabilities. She paused in her tracing to meet his eyes directly. For instance, your current stress levels are elevated but not panic level, suggesting adaptability to unusual circumstances. Daniel found himself caught between embarrassment, fascination, and a growing appreciation for the absurdity of his situation. Most humans would consider waking up naked with a stranger sitting on them to be a fairly unusual circumstance. Most humans have not previously encountered members of my species, which means their behavioral responses would be based on incomplete information about appropriate social interaction norms. Kira resumed her systematic examination, apparently finding the conversation secondary to her scientific assessment. Your responses suggest flexible thinking rather than rigid adherence to species-specific behavioral patterns. Is that good or bad from a first contact perspective? Good for establishing productive interspecies cooperation. Bad for predicting future behavioral patterns based on established cultural norms. Kira completed what appeared to be a comprehensive physical assessment and finally shifted off his chest, settling into a cross-legged position beside his emergency bedding. Your species appears suitable for extended diplomatic contact rather than immediate elimination or quarantine protocols. Daniel sat up, pulling his emergency blanket around himself in a gesture toward modesty that Kira observed with scientific interest. I'm glad I passed the not requiring immediate elimination assessment. The evaluation is ongoing, Kira said seriously, though Daniel caught what might have been amusement in her expression. Though preliminary results suggest your presence is compatible with local ecological systems and potentially beneficial for expanded cultural exchange programs. Cultural exchange programs? Learning about each other's species through direct interaction and shared experiences. Kira gestured at his shelter, his emergency supplies, and the alien jungle surrounding them. Your crash provides optimal opportunity for controlled first contact under conditions that minimize political complications. Daniel looked around at his emergency shelter, at the alien woman who'd apparently spent hours conducting biological surveys while he slept, at the bioluminescent jungle that surrounded them with unknown dangers and possibilities. So what you're saying is that my catastrophic ship failure has accidentally created an ideal situation for first contact between our species. Essentially correct, Kira agreed. Though the success of such cultural exchange depends largely on your adaptability to interaction norms that may differ significantly from your species' usual social expectations. Daniel considered this, looking at Kira who was watching him with the patient curiosity of a scientist observing an interesting experiment in progress. And these interaction norms include conducting biological assessments on sleeping strangers. Among other practices that your species may find unusual, Kira said, her expression suggesting that his education in interspecies social norms was just beginning. Daniel realized that his emergency survival situation had just become significantly more complicated than anything his pilot training had covered. On the other hand, it was also probably going to be more interesting than anything he'd experienced during years of routine cargo hauling between civilized star systems. Well, he said finally, I suppose if I'm going to be stranded here for a while, I should probably learn about these unusual interaction norms. Excellent, Kira said, her bioluminescent skin brightening slightly in what Daniel hoped indicated approval rather than predatory anticipation. Your education begins with understanding why physical proximity is essential for accurate communication between our species. Daniel pulled his emergency blanket more securely around himself, suspecting that his concepts of personal space were about to be thoroughly challenged by someone whose scientific approach to first contact apparently didn't include conventional boundaries about personal privacy. Daniel's first lesson in interspecies communication began with what Kira described as basic proximity protocols, and what he experienced as having his personal space systematically dismantled by someone who treated physical boundaries as optional suggestions rather than fundamental social requirements. Your species communicates primarily through auditory vibrations and visual gestures, Kira explained, positioning herself close enough that Daniel could feel the warmth radiating from her luminescent skin. My species requires biochemical analysis of pheromone emissions and electromagnetic field fluctuations for accurate information transfer. Biochemical analysis meaning you need to be close enough to smell me? Among other sensory inputs, yes. Kira leaned closer, and Daniel watched patterns of light shift across her skin in what appeared to be some form of emotional or physiological expression. Your pheromone emissions indicate stress, curiosity, and what appears to be social confusion regarding appropriate interaction distances. Daniel had managed to locate his emergency clothing and achieve some semblance of modesty, though Kira's continued scientific interest in his behavioral patterns made him feel like he was being observed by a very polite but extremely persistent anthropologist. Social confusion is probably accurate. Where I come from, sitting that close to someone you've just met usually implies either romantic interest or impending violence. Interesting cultural framework. My people would interpret such distance as indicating either deep distrust or preliminary assessment for potential consumption as food source. Kira's bioluminescent patterns shifted to what Daniel hoped represented amusement rather than hunger. Your cultural norms appear to assume that physical proximity equals emotional or sexual intimacy, rather than basic communication necessity. Physical proximity for basic communication. Accurate pheromone analysis requires close-range chemical detection. Electromagnetic field monitoring needs direct contact or minimal separation. Biorhythmic synchronization for emotional context requires shared breathing space. Kira demonstrated by moving closer until Daniel could feel her heartbeat through some form of bioelectric field sensing. Without these communication channels, conversation between our species would be limited to crude approximations rather than meaningful information exchange. Daniel found himself caught between fascination with her explanation and deep discomfort with the practical implications. So for you to understand what I'm actually trying to communicate, you need to be close enough to monitor my biological responses. Essentially correct. Though your species' communication methods are admirably sophisticated for beings who rely primarily on vocal vibrations and facial expressions. Kira shifted position, and Daniel realized she was unconsciously adjusting her distance based on reading signals from his electromagnetic field that he wasn't even aware he was broadcasting. Your current biosignatures suggest acceptance of proximity combined with lingering uncertainty about cultural appropriateness. That's surprisingly accurate. Biochemical communication is considerably more precise than verbal approximations, though it requires cultural adaptation from species accustomed to maintaining artificial separation barriers. Kira began unpacking what appeared to be food supplies from a container that Daniel hadn't noticed her carrying. Shared meals provide optimal opportunity for cultural exchange while maintaining necessary communication proximity. Daniel watched her prepare what looked like a combination of local fruits and preserved protein that probably represented her species' equivalent of travel rations. Shared meals meaning we eat together while you continue monitoring my biological responses. Shared meals meaning we establish basic trust through mutual vulnerability while exchanging cultural information about food preferences, dietary requirements, and social eating customs. Kira offered him something that resembled fruit but glowed softly with internal bioluminescence. Your species' digestive system should be compatible with most local flora, though some items may produce unexpected physiological responses. Daniel accepted the offered food, noting that it felt warm to the touch and seemed to pulse gently with some form of internal energy. Unexpected physiological responses meaning it might poison me. More likely it will produce digestive experiences that your species might find unusual but not dangerous. Kira took a bite of her own food, and Daniel watched her bioluminescent patterns shift in ways that suggested satisfaction or pleasure. Local biochemistry operates on principles that may challenge digestive systems evolved in different environments. Daniel bit into the glowing fruit, discovering flavors that his taste buds struggled to categorize, sweet, but with metallic undertones and what might have been carbonation that seemed to develop after swallowing. This is, definitely not like anything from human agricultural systems. Your facial expressions indicate surprise but not distress, which suggests successful initial dietary adaptation. Kira offered him another piece, this one resembling meat but with crystalline structures that caught light in prismatic patterns. This protein source should provide adequate nutrition while introducing your digestive system to local biochemical processes. Daniel tried the crystalline protein, immediately regretting his adventurous approach to alien cuisine as his mouth filled with sensations that seemed to involve every taste bud simultaneously while producing what felt like mild electrical stimulation of his nervous system. That's definitely producing unexpected physiological responses. Your biosignatures indicate sensory overload combined with digestive surprise, but no indicators of toxic reaction. Kira moved closer, apparently reading his biological responses with the efficiency of a medical scanner. The electrical stimulation should fade within several minutes, leaving enhanced sensory sensitivity that most species find pleasant. Enhanced sensory sensitivity. Improved taste, smell, and touch perception. Local biochemistry includes compounds that temporarily optimize nervous system function for better environmental awareness. Kira's proximity allowed Daniel to notice that her own scent was changing, becoming more complex and somehow more interesting as the alien food affected his enhanced sensory perception. Though the effects may make physical proximity even more noticeable than usual. Daniel realized that as his senses sharpened, he was becoming increasingly aware of Kira's presence in ways that went beyond visual observation, the subtle electromagnetic field she projected, the complex chemistry of her pheromone emissions, even what might have been some form of bioelectric communication that operated below the threshold of conscious awareness. This is either the most interesting meal I've ever eaten, or I'm experiencing some form of controlled poisoning that happens to be educational, Daniel said, accepting another piece of crystalline protein despite his better judgment. Both interpretations are essentially accurate, Kira replied, her bioluminescent patterns shifting into configurations that Daniel's enhanced senses somehow interpreted as laughter. Shared consumption of local biochemistry creates temporary physiological synchronization that improves interspecies communication while providing necessary nutrition. Physiological synchronization. Your biorhythms are beginning to match local environmental frequencies, which allows for more accurate pheromone interpretation and bioelectric field compatibility. Kira demonstrated by placing her hand near his, and Daniel felt a subtle resonance between their electromagnetic fields that seemed to facilitate some form of nonverbal communication. Enhanced sensory perception allows your species to access communication channels that normally require evolutionary adaptation. Daniel looked at his hand, which was apparently broadcasting biological information to someone who could read it like a complex technical manual, while simultaneously receiving data from her bioelectric field that his brain was somehow learning to interpret. You're saying that eating your food is temporarily upgrading my communication capabilities to include channels my species doesn't normally access. Temporary biochemical enhancement that facilitates meaningful cultural exchange between species with different evolutionary communication strategies, Kira confirmed, offering him what appeared to be a dessert item that glowed with soft, shifting colors. Though the enhanced sensitivity also means that cultural misunderstandings regarding physical proximity may become more noticeable. Daniel accepted the glowing dessert, which tasted like something halfway between chocolate and lightning while producing sensations that seemed to involve taste buds he didn't know he possessed. More noticeable how? Your species' social boundaries regarding personal space will feel increasingly artificial as you become more aware of the biological communication that occurs during close proximity interaction. Kira moved closer, and Daniel's enhanced senses registered the complex chemistry of her emotional state, the electromagnetic patterns that seemed to correspond to thoughts and intentions, and subtle bioelectric signals that conveyed meaning without requiring spoken language. Most species find the enhanced communication capabilities more than compensate for temporary adjustment to different proximity comfort zones. Daniel realized that his concern about personal space was gradually being replaced by fascination with the layers of information available through biological communication channels he'd never known existed. Kira's presence had shifted from being an invasion of his privacy to being a source of data that his enhanced senses were learning to interpret as naturally as spoken language. This is either the most sophisticated approach to first contact I've ever heard of, or the most elaborate seduction technique in galactic history, Daniel said, though his enhanced senses told him that Kira's intentions were genuinely scientific rather than romantic. Both approaches share similar methodologies, Kira replied, her bioluminescent patterns shifting into configurations that Daniel's temporarily upgraded nervous system interpreted as professional amusement mixed with something that might have been personal interest. Though the primary objective is establishing communication protocols that allow for meaningful cultural exchange rather than biological reproduction. Primary objective being cultural exchange, but not necessarily excluding other possibilities. Cultural exchange often leads to various forms of interpersonal connection, depending on compatibility factors that become apparent through enhanced communication. Kira's proximity and Daniel's heightened sensitivity combined to create awareness of her emotional and physiological state that was both intimate and strangely comfortable. Though such developments would be secondary to successful first contact establishment. Daniel found himself in the unique position of participating in what was simultaneously a diplomatic mission, a xenobiological experiment, and possibly the beginning of something personal that he didn't have adequate cultural framework to categorize. Well, this is definitely the most educationally comprehensive crash landing I've ever experienced. Educational value is optimal when both participants maintain openness to communication methods that exceed their species' normal social parameters, Kira said, her enhanced proximity allowing Daniel to sense something that felt remarkably like affection mixed with scientific curiosity and genuine personal interest in him as an individual rather than just as a research subject. Daniel realized that his vulnerability during sleep had led to a form of connection that bypassed all the usual barriers that prevented meaningful first contact between different species. What had started as invasion of his privacy was becoming collaboration in mutual discovery that neither of them had anticipated. I suppose, he said, his enhanced senses registering Kira's positive response to his acceptance of their unusual situation, if I'm going to be stranded here anyway, I might as well learn everything I can about interspecies communication. Excellent approach to unexpected cultural opportunities, Kira replied, and Daniel's temporarily upgraded nervous system interpreted her bioluminescent response as satisfaction mixed with something that felt distinctly like anticipation for whatever they might discover together. Daniel's introduction to alien pathogens came with all the subtlety of a systems failure cascade, progressing from slightly under the weather to questioning fundamental life choices in approximately 6 hours. What had started as minor digestive discomfort from yesterday's adventurous approach to local cuisine had evolved into something that made his emergency medical scanner emit distressed beeping sounds while displaying readings that seemed mathematically impossible. Your biosignatures are indicating systematic immune response failure, Kira said, her scientific tone not quite masking what Daniel's pathogen-addled brain interpreted as genuine concern. Local microorganisms appear to be challenging your species' defensive biological systems in ways that exceed normal adaptation parameters. Daniel tried to respond with something appropriately stoic and pilot professional, but what came out was more like a groan that suggested his vocabulary had been temporarily reduced to expressions of existential suffering. The alien biochemistry that had enhanced his communication abilities yesterday was apparently having a delayed reaction that involved every system in his body staging a coordinated rebellion. The enhanced sensory capabilities from local biochemical exposure may have created temporary vulnerabilities to microorganisms that your immune system lacks experience processing, Kira continued, moving closer with the kind of focused attention that Daniel's fever-scrambled thoughts recognized as the transition from scientific observer to medical practitioner. Immediate intervention is required to prevent serious physiological damage. Intervention meaning what? Daniel managed to ask, though speaking seemed to require considerably more effort than usual. Continuous bioregulatory support until your immune system adapts to local pathogenic challenges. Kira began unpacking medical supplies that looked like a combination of advanced technology and organic materials that might have been grown rather than manufactured. My species' healing practices require direct physical contact for monitoring and treatment, which means temporary abandonment of your cultural preferences regarding personal space. Daniel's fever-addled brain processed this information with the efficiency of a damaged computer trying to run complex calculations. Direct physical contact meaning skin-to-skin contact for biorhythm monitoring, shared electromagnetic field regulation, and chemical transfer of immune system support compounds. Kira began setting up what appeared to be a medical monitoring system that looked like it had been designed by people who understood biology at levels that exceeded human medical knowledge. Treatment effectiveness requires continuous proximity for several days while your body learns to process local biological challenges. Several days of continuous physical contact. Several days of medical monitoring that happens to require physical proximity for optimal treatment effectiveness, Kira corrected, though her bioluminescent pattern suggested she understood that the distinction was largely academic from Daniel's perspective. Your fever is affecting cognitive function, but treatment protocols remain the same regardless of patient comfort with necessary medical procedures. Daniel realized that his illness was going to require exactly the kind of extended intimate contact that his cultural background had taught him to associate with romantic relationships, except in this context it was medical necessity being administered by someone whose approach to personal boundaries already operated according to completely different social parameters. Right, he said, his weakened condition making philosophical objections to medical treatment seem less important than not dying on an alien planet. What do I need to do? You need to remain conscious and cooperative while I monitor your biological systems and provide immune support through direct biochemical transfer. Kira moved to sit beside him, her proximity immediately noticeable as her bioelectric field began synchronizing with his own. The process requires trust, since resistance to treatment will interfere with healing effectiveness. Daniel felt Kira's hand settle on his chest, and immediately his enhanced senses, apparently still functional despite his illness, registered the complex chemistry of her healing abilities. Her bioluminescent skin patterns shifted into configurations that seemed to correspond with diagnostic procedures, while her electromagnetic field began some form of active medical intervention that his body responded to at cellular levels. This is... Daniel paused, struggling to describe sensations that human language probably didn't have adequate vocabulary to address. This feels like you're conducting medical treatment directly through biological communication channels. Accurate assessment. My species' medical practices involve temporary biological integration for diagnosis and treatment of conditions that affect interspecies physiology. Kira's continued monitoring revealed information about his condition that she processed with the efficiency of a sophisticated medical scanner. Your immune system is learning to recognize and process local microorganisms, but requires support to prevent systemic failure during the adaptation period. Biological integration. Shared biological processes for medical purposes. Temporary synchronization of biorhythms, immune responses, and cellular repair mechanisms. Kira's proximity and continued physical contact created the sensation that his body was being supported by biological systems that operated at levels of sophistication his species hadn't developed. Think of it as external immune system support while your internal systems adapt to environmental challenges. Daniel found himself relaxing into treatment that involved levels of biological intimacy he'd never experienced, while simultaneously feeling safer than he had since crashing on this planet. Kira's medical abilities created a sense of being protected not just from immediate illness, but from environmental threats that he hadn't even been aware of. "How long have you been providing this kind of medical support?" he asked, his fever-scrambled timeline suddenly suggesting that his recovery might have been actively managed rather than naturally occurring. Since detecting early-stage pathogenic exposure approximately 18 hours ago, Kira admitted, her bioluminescent patterns shifting into what Daniel interpreted as mild embarrassment. Initial treatment began during your sleep cycles to prevent serious illness development. You've been treating me medically while I've been unconscious. Preventive medical intervention to avoid the necessity for more intensive treatment procedures. Kira's continued monitoring suggested that her early intervention had been both necessary and effective. Though current pathogenic response requires more active treatment than subtle immune system support. Daniel realized that Kira's scientific interest in his biological functions had included medical monitoring and treatment that had probably saved his life, administered with the same matter-of-fact professionalism she'd shown while conducting xenobiological surveys. "So you've been functioning as my personal physician as well as my first contact specialist." Medical treatment and cultural exchange are closely related when dealing with species adaptation to unfamiliar environments. Kira's treatment protocols seem to involve maintaining physical contact while monitoring dozens of biological indicators simultaneously. Successful first contact often requires preventing visiting species from dying of environmental exposure. Practical approach to diplomacy. Practical approach to keeping interesting research subjects alive long enough for meaningful cultural exchange, Kira replied, though her bioluminescent pattern suggested personal investment that exceeded purely scientific interest. As the treatment continued, Daniel found himself experiencing the kind of vulnerability that went beyond mere physical exposure. Kira's medical procedures required his complete trust while she conducted biological interventions at cellular levels throughout his body. Her healing abilities created intimacy that was both medical and personal, professional and deeply caring. "This is either the most comprehensive medical treatment I've ever received, or the most elaborate way of establishing personal connection in the history of interspecies relations, Daniel said, his enhanced senses registering Kira's emotional responses to his condition and treatment. Both interpretations are accurate, Kira replied, her continued physical contact revealing the complexity of her feelings about his illness, her medical responsibilities, and her growing personal attachment to him as an individual. Though the primary concern is ensuring your survival and successful adaptation to local environmental conditions. Primary concern being my survival, but not the only concern. Medical treatment often creates personal connections between practitioner and patient, especially when treatment requires extended biological integration for healing effectiveness. Kira's proximity and continued monitoring allowed Daniel to sense something that felt like affection mixed with professional concern and genuine care for his well-being. Such connections are natural results of successful medical intervention, though they represent secondary developments to primary treatment objectives. Daniel realized that his illness was creating exactly the kind of forced intimacy and mutual dependence that normally developed over months or years of relationship building, compressed into days of medical necessity that required complete trust and biological cooperation. So we're essentially speedrunning the trust-building phase of interpersonal relationships through medical crisis management. Essentially accurate, though the trust being established is based on genuine mutual care rather than mere survival necessity. Kira's treatment continued with the steady competence of someone whose medical abilities were matched by personal investment in his recovery. Though recovery will require several more days of continuous treatment before your immune system can function independently. Several more days of biological integration and physical proximity. Several more days of medical treatment that happen to create optimal conditions for continued cultural exchange and personal connection development, Kira corrected, though Daniel's enhanced senses told him that she was looking forward to the extended time together for reasons that exceeded purely professional interest. Daniel settled into accepting treatment that was simultaneously saving his life and creating relationship dynamics he'd never experienced, administered by someone whose combination of scientific competence and personal care was unlike anything in his previous experience. His vulnerability had become the foundation for connection that neither of them had anticipated but both were discovering they valued. Well, he said, his improving condition allowing him to appreciate the complexity of what was developing between them. If I have to be seriously ill on an alien planet, I'm glad it's with someone whose medical treatment includes personal investment in patient outcomes. Personal investment in successful treatment outcomes is standard medical practice, Kira replied, though her bioluminescent response suggested that her investment in his particular case exceeded standard professional parameters by considerable margins. Daniel realized that his crash landing had led not just to first contact between their species, but to personal contact that was proving more meaningful than anything he'd experienced during years of solitary space travel. His complete vulnerability had become the beginning of genuine partnership that neither of them had planned but both were committed to developing. The rescue ship's arrival was announced by Daniel's emergency beacon finally connecting with the Galactic communication network, followed immediately by his recovery coordinator's voice crackling through the comm system with the aggressive cheerfulness of someone whose job involved retrieving stranded pilots from unpleasant situations. Daniel Chen, this is Rescue Coordination Center Vega 7. We have a recovery team inbound to your location with an estimated arrival time of 6 hours. Please confirm your status and prepare for immediate evacuation. Daniel looked at Kira, who was still maintaining the close proximity that her medical treatment required, though his recovery had progressed to the point where biological integration was more about monitoring than active intervention. That's my ride home. Your species rescue protocols are impressively efficient, Kira replied, though her bioluminescent pattern suggested something that might have been disappointment mixed with scientific curiosity. Though immediate evacuation may complicate the ongoing cultural exchange program we have established. Cultural exchange program. Extended first contact between our species, involving comprehensive biological and cultural data gathering that has produced significant insights into interspecies compatibility factors. Kira's proximity allowed Daniel to sense that her scientific interest in their interaction was matched by personal feelings that had developed beyond professional curiosity. Such opportunities are rare and typically require extended time periods for optimal data collection. Daniel realized that what he'd experienced as recovery from a crash landing, Kira had experienced as a carefully managed first contact situation that represented significant scientific and diplomatic opportunities for her people. "You're saying that my rescue represents the end of valuable research into human-alien interaction patterns." "I'm saying that 6 days of intensive cultural exchange has produced preliminary data suggesting high compatibility between our species, but comprehensive analysis would require extended observation periods." Kira began reviewing data that her bioluminescent patterns had apparently been recording throughout their time together. "Though your return to normal duties represents successful completion of the rescue phase of this interaction." Daniel watched her compile what appeared to be comprehensive reports on everything from his biological responses to alien cuisine to his adaptation patterns for non-human social norms. "Kira, exactly what kind of research have you been conducting?" "Comprehensive first contact analysis covering biological compatibility, cultural adaptation potential, communication protocol effectiveness, and interpersonal relationship development patterns between our species." Kira's scientific summary couldn't quite mask the personal investment that had developed alongside her professional observations. Data that could influence future diplomatic contact policies between our civilizations. Relationship development patterns. Analysis of how individuals from different species establish trust, navigate cultural differences, develop emotional connections, and adapt to biological intimacy requirements for effective communication. Kira's proximity allowed Daniel to sense the complexity of her feelings about their developing relationship. Such data is crucial for establishing protocols for successful interspecies diplomatic exchange. Daniel felt pieces of understanding click into place with the uncomfortable precision of someone realizing they'd been participating in a research study without fully understanding the scope of the investigation. "So our entire interaction has been a diplomatic research project studying human-alien relationship development. Our entire interaction has been genuine personal connection that happens to provide valuable scientific data about interspecies compatibility," Kira corrected, her bioluminescent response suggesting that the distinction was important to her. "Though the research applications are significant for future contact between our peoples." Genuine personal connection with research applications. Personal connection that developed beyond initial research parameters and became valuable for reasons that exceed scientific data collection. Kira's continued proximity allowed Daniel to sense the depth of her feelings, which had clearly evolved beyond professional interest into something more personal and complex. Though the research data remains scientifically significant. The rescue ship's approach signature appeared on Daniel's emergency scanner, indicating that his return to normal life was approaching with the efficiency of professional rescue operations. He looked at the scanner, then at Kira, then at the alien jungle that had been his home for the past week. "What if I told the rescue team that I needed additional time for equipment recovery?" Daniel asked, surprising himself with the question. Additional time for equipment recovery? Additional time to complete cultural exchange activities that might have scientific value for future diplomatic contact between our species. Daniel found himself unwilling to end what had developed between them, despite not having adequate vocabulary to describe exactly what that was. How much additional research time would be optimal for comprehensive data collection? Kira's bioluminescent patterns shifted through configurations that Daniel had learned to recognize as surprise, hope, and something that might have been joy mixed with scientific excitement. Comprehensive interspecies relationship analysis typically requires several months of observation across various environmental and social conditions. Several months. Long enough to establish genuine partnership patterns, test compatibility under various circumstances, and document adaptation processes that could serve as models for future interspecies diplomatic cooperation. Kira moved closer, her proximity allowing Daniel to sense the depth of her hope that he might actually consider extending their time together. Though such extended research would require significant personal commitment from both research subjects. Daniel looked around at his emergency shelter, which had become home in ways that his cargo freighter berth had never achieved, then at Kira, whose scientific partnership had evolved into something that felt more meaningful than any relationship he'd developed during years of routine space travel. Personal commitment to scientific research with valuable diplomatic applications, he said, his enhanced senses registering Kira's positive response to his apparent consideration of extended participation in their cultural exchange program. Personal commitment to continued partnership that happens to have valuable scientific and diplomatic applications, Kira replied, her bioluminescent response making it clear that her interest in extended collaboration was based on personal feelings rather than just research opportunities. Daniel activated his communication system, connecting with the incoming rescue team with the efficiency of someone making a significant life decision. Rescue Coordination Center, this is Daniel Chen. I'm requesting extended time on planet for recovery of valuable cargo and completion of first contact protocols with local intelligent species. First contact protocols. The rescue coordinator's voice carried the confusion of someone whose training covered equipment recovery but not diplomatic situations. Daniel, we need clarification on your current status. My status is healthy, safe, and engaged in productive cultural exchange with friendly local inhabitants who have provided medical assistance and diplomatic contact opportunities. Daniel looked at Kira, whose bioluminescent response suggested enthusiastic approval of his decision. I'm requesting permission to extend my stay for comprehensive first contact documentation that could have significant value for future interspecies relations. Stand by for consultation with diplomatic authorities. Daniel closed the communication channel and turned to face Kira directly. So, assuming my government approves extended cultural exchange research, what exactly are we talking about in terms of research methodology? Extended observation of partnership development under various conditions, comprehensive analysis of interspecies compatibility factors, and documentation of adaptation processes that could serve as models for future diplomatic cooperation between our civilizations. Kira's scientific explanation couldn't hide her personal excitement about the possibility of continued collaboration. Though the research would require genuine personal investment rather than clinical observation. Genuine personal investment in interspecies relationship development. Genuine personal investment in partnership that happens to provide valuable research data about how individuals from different species can establish meaningful connections despite biological and cultural differences. Kira moved to sit beside him, her proximity creating the kind of biological communication that had become comfortable and familiar over their time together. Research that could benefit both our peoples while allowing us to explore whatever is developing between us personally. Daniel realized that his decision to stay was motivated by personal feelings that had developed alongside their professional collaboration, creating the kind of connection that he'd never expected to find through crash landing on an alien planet. So we continue our cultural exchange program with expanded research parameters and personal investment in outcomes. We continue our partnership with scientific applications and personal development that could benefit both of us individually and our species diplomatically. Kira's bioluminescent response carried warmth that Daniel's enhanced senses interpreted as affection mixed with excitement about their extended time together. Though success will depend on continued adaptability to interaction norms that exceed both our species' usual social parameters. Interaction norms including extended biological proximity and communication methods that require physical intimacy for optimal effectiveness. Among other cultural adaptations that we can explore together over extended time periods, Kira replied, her proximity and bioluminescent pattern suggesting that she was looking forward to discovering what their partnership could develop into given adequate time and opportunity. Daniel's communication system activated with his rescue coordinator's response. Daniel Chen, you are authorized for extended cultural exchange research with diplomatic oversight and regular status reports. Congratulations on successful first contact establishment. Well, Daniel said, settling into accepting that his crash landing had permanently altered his career trajectory from cargo hauling to interspecies diplomatic research, I guess this makes it official. Extended cultural exchange with comprehensive research applications and personal investment in successful outcomes. Extended partnership with mutual benefits for personal development and interspecies understanding, Kira agreed, her bioluminescent response expressing satisfaction that their accidental meeting had evolved into deliberate collaboration with unlimited potential for both scientific and personal discovery. Daniel realized that his vulnerability during that first night of sleep had led not just to first contact between their species, but to personal connection that was proving more meaningful than anything he'd experienced during years of routine space travel. His complete exposure had become the foundation for partnership that neither of them had planned, but both were committed to developing through whatever discoveries lay ahead. The question was no longer whether he could adapt to interaction norms that exceeded his species' usual social parameters, but how much they could discover together when cultural exchange became genuine partnership built on trust, scientific curiosity, and personal connection that had developed beyond anything either of them had anticipated. Given that their accidental meeting had already exceeded every expectation he'd had about first contact, diplomatic research, and personal relationships, Daniel was looking forward to finding out.